The map hit the table between them like a verdict. Violet Bailey's hand did not tremble. It never trembled. That was the first thing Alfred Merritt noticed about her, even before he registered the document itself, even before he understood what the lines and markings on that yellowed paper meant. Her hand was steady, her dark eyes were locked on his face, and her jaw was set in that particular way that told a man she was waiting to see if he would flinch. He almost did. Because the map showed something that could get them both killed. "You came here looking for work," Violet said, her voice low and precise. Each word measured the way a surgeon measures a cut. "So here it is. The work." Alfred stared at the paper. The lines were intricate, drawn in two different hands, one careful and architectural, the other hurried and slanting, as though written under duress or by firelight. There were coordinates he recognized from his time scouting for the Union Pacific before the railroad men had grown too greedy and he had grown too honest. There were landmarks he knew. Deadfall Ridge, the dry canyon locals called the Devil's Throat. And at the center of the map, circled twice in dark ink, a location that made something cold move through his chest. "That's Callaway territory," he said. "Yes," she said. "Harlan Callaway." "Yes, Violet." He pushed the map back toward her, not because he was afraid, but because he needed her to understand the weight of what she was handing him. "Harlan Callaway has killed 4 men that I know of personally. 3 of them were armed and none of them were fools. My husband was the 5th, she said, and the room went absolutely silent. That silence changed everything. Alfred Merritt had ridden into the town of Sorrow Creek, New Mexico, on a Wednesday in early October of 1884, with 43 cents in his coat pocket, a horse that needed new shoes, and the particular kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from physical hardship, but from 2 years of drifting without purpose. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that had done every kind of work the frontier demanded: carpentry, cattle driving, mine assay, scouting, fence repair, and a brief and deeply unpleasant stint as a deputy in a town in Colorado that had taught him everything he needed to know about the corruption that hid behind a badge. He had no dark past in the outlaw sense. He had killed 2 men in his life, both in clear self-defense, and both incidents had hollowed something out of him that had never fully refilled. He was not a violent man by temperament. He was, at his core, a man who believed in honest labor and quiet evenings, and who had not yet found the place where those things were available to him simultaneously. Sorrow Creek was a small town, not quite a town, and not quite just a settlement. It had a general store run by a heavyset man named Percival Dodds who spoke too loudly and smiled too quickly. It had a livery stable, a single-room schoolhouse that appeared to be closed for lack of a teacher, a barber shop that doubled as the local physician's office, and a saloon called the Tin Cup that smelled of sawdust and old grief. The church had been struck by lightning 2 years prior, and was being slowly rebuilt by a volunteer crew that showed up irregularly and argued more than they hammered. Alfred had ridden in looking for a meal and the possibility of work. He had asked at the general store, and Percival Dodds had looked him over with the particular wariness small-town merchants reserve for drifters, then suggested he might try the Bailey spread 2 miles east of town. The Widow Bailey, Alfred had asked. The only Bailey left, Dodds had said, and gone back to his ledger. Alfred had not known then that those words contained a whole tragedy. He had simply ridden east. The Bailey property was neither as run-down as he had expected nor as well-maintained as it might once have been. The main house was solid, built from good timber and river stone, 2 stories with a covered porch that wrapped around the south and east sides. The barn needed paint, and one of the fence rails along the front pasture had been repaired with a different wood, giving it the look of a broken bone improperly set. But the garden was extraordinary. Even in October, with summer's abundance winding down, the kitchen garden beside the house was a testament to someone's fierce attention: neat rows, proper companion planting, a cold frame built against the south wall of the house to extend the growing season, herbs hanging to dry under the porch overhang in carefully labeled bundles. Someone here paid deep attention to living things. He had not yet met Violet Bailey when he noticed the garden, but later he would understand that the garden was her in miniature, precise, purposeful, fiercely alive, and built to survive conditions that would defeat lesser efforts. He knocked at the door. No answer. He waited. The wind moved through the big cottonwood at the corner of the yard and sent a shower of gold leaves across the porch boards. Somewhere behind the barn, he heard the sound of steady, rhythmic impact, not hammering, something else. He walked around the side of the house and stopped. The woman had her back to him. She was standing at a surveying instrument, a brass theodolite mounted on a wooden tripod, and she was looking through the eyepiece with complete concentration, one hand adjusting the leveling screws, the other making notations in a field book without looking away from the instrument. Beside her, a chain and set of marking stakes were laid out in a pattern that told Alfred she had been working this section for hours. She was measuring something, measuring it with professional precision. She was perhaps 28, he guessed. Dark hair pulled back practically under a wide-brimmed hat. She wore a man's work coat over what appeared to be a divided skirt, the practical kind that allowed real movement, and her boots were muddy in a way that said she had been at this since morning. She was not small, but she was not large. She was simply present in a way that took up exactly the space required and no more. He said, "Excuse me, ma'am." She held up one finger without turning around or moving from the eyepiece. The gesture was so automatic and confident that he stopped speaking immediately. He stood and waited while she completed whatever sighting she was taking, wrote 3 more numbers in her field book, then straightened and turned to face him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the afternoon light, and they assessed him with the same methodical efficiency she had just applied to the landscape. He had the distinct sensation of being measured. "You're the man Dodds sent," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Alfred Merritt. I'm looking for work." "What kind of work can you do?" "Most kinds," he said. "Carpentry, fence work, cattle, general repair. I've done some scouting and survey work with the railroad. I can read and I can do figures." Something shifted in her expression at the word survey. Not exactly warmth, but a kind of heightened attention, the way a door opens a crack. "Survey work," she repeated. "With the railroad or independent?" "Both. I worked 2 seasons with the UP out of Cheyenne. Before that I helped a land surveyor named Orville Marsh out of Santa Fe do boundary work for 3 ranches and 2 mining claims." "Do you know how to use a transit?" "I know how to use a theodolite," he said, nodding at the instrument beside her. "Which is what you have there." "A Buff and Berger looks like. Good instrument." She studied him for another moment. Then she said, "My name is Violet Bailey. My husband Thomas died 14 months ago. I run this property alone. I can offer you room and board and fair wages for a month's trial. The work involves fence repair, some carpentry, cattle management, and survey assistance. The survey work is the most important." "What are you surveying?" he asked. She paused, and in that pause he felt the first hint of something hidden, something she was weighing whether to share. Then she said, "My property boundary. There's a dispute." He took the work. He learned the shape of the Bailey property in his first week, walking every fence line, cataloging what needed repair and what needed replacement entirely. The ranch ran 240 acres on paper, or at least it had run that when Thomas Bailey had filed his deed. The problem, which Violet explained to him on the second evening over a supper of beans and cornbread, was that someone had been moving the boundary markers. "Not gradually," she said, spreading a paper across the kitchen table. It was a copy of the original land survey, and she had overlaid it with her own more recent measurements in red ink. "All at once, or close to it. 12 of my western markers have been relocated. Minimum 80 acres of my best grazing land has been absorbed into the neighboring property." "Who owns the neighboring property?" She looked at him steadily. "Harlan Calloway." He knew the name. Most people in this part of New Mexico knew the name. Harlan Calloway was 52 years old and had been accumulating land in this territory for 15 years through a combination of purchase, intimidation, legal manipulation, and it was widely suspected but impossible to prove murder. He controlled 3 of the 5 water sources in the region and had been known to use that control as a weapon when a neighboring rancher proved reluctant to sell at his price. Thomas Bailey had been one such reluctant rancher. "Your husband refused to sell to Calloway," Alfred said. "Multiple times," Violet confirmed. "And then Thomas died." She said this without her voice changing, but something in her eyes went very deep and very still. The official ruling was an accident. He fell from his horse on the Ridge Road. The horse came home without him, and they found him the next morning. "You don't believe it was an accident?" "Thomas Bailey had ridden that Ridge Road every week for 9 years, she said. "He could have ridden it asleep. No, I do not believe it was an accident." Alfred was quiet for a moment. "Have you gone to the county sheriff?" The look she gave him was not contemptuous, but it carried a particular shade of weariness that told him she had been naive enough once to try that, and the experience had cured her thoroughly. "Sheriff Amos Trent has been Calloway's man since 1879, she said. "If I walked into his office with a sworn statement signed by God Almighty, he would find a reason to file it incorrectly." Alfred looked at the survey overlay she had made. The precision of it was remarkable. The lines were exact, the measurements annotated clearly, the corrections made with geometric care. "You did all this yourself?" he asked. "I've been surveying since I was 16, she said, and there was no pride in her voice, just fact. "My father was a land surveyor. He had no sons. He taught me everything he knew because he was practical enough to understand that a skill doesn't care who holds it." She paused. "I am, if I say so myself, very good at it." Alfred believed her without question. He had seen the precision of her field work. She was not just competent, she was genuinely expert. "So you have the evidence," he said. "The survey proves the boundary was moved." "Yes." "But a survey conducted by the party with the complaint is not legally sufficient on its own. It needs to be corroborated by a licensed surveyor or by reference to the original government survey records." She folded her hands on the table. "The original survey records for this section of New Mexico territory are held in the land office in Santa Fe. They were filed by the General Land Office in 1871. If I can obtain a certified copy of those records and present them alongside my own measurements, it constitutes legal proof that the markers were moved. Can't you simply write to Santa Fe and request the records?" "I did," she said, 3 times. Each request was lost or delayed or returned incomplete. Calloway has connections in Santa Fe. Not surprising, he has connections everywhere. She stood and moved to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, opened a drawer, and withdrew a paper she set in front of him. "But I also found something else." The paper was a letter, handwritten, dated 8 months earlier. It was from a man named Ezra Potts, who identified himself as a retired government surveyor, who had been part of the original 1871 survey crew. He wrote to inform Violet that he had retained personal copies of his field notes from that survey, the original measurements, taken before any deeds were filed, and that he had heard about the boundary dispute through a mutual acquaintance and believed his notes might be of assistance. He offered to provide a sworn affidavit based on those notes. His address was in the town of Redemption, Arizona Territory, approximately 280 miles to the west. "I need someone to go to Redemption and bring back that affidavit," Violet said. "I can't go myself. I can't leave this property. Calloway's men have been pushing the southern fence, testing it. If I'm gone, I'll come back to find the cattle scattered and the fence torn down and no one able to say who did it." She paused. "I also need someone I can trust with this, which has been the difficulty." Alfred read the letter again. "Why do you trust me?" he asked. "You've known me a week." "I don't trust you," she said plainly. "Not yet. But Orville Marsh is a man of impeccable reputation in this territory, And when I sent him a wire asking about Alfred Merritt, he replied that you were the most honest man he'd ever hired and the best with a level and chain he'd seen outside of a licensed surveyor. That's a starting point. Alfred was surprised. He had worked for Marsh 4 years ago and had not expected to be remembered so specifically. He felt something warm move through him at the words and then felt slightly embarrassed by that feeling. "There's something else," Violet said. She went back to the desk and withdrew a second paper, older than the first, the edges worn from handling. She placed it before him. It was the map. Even before he understood all its details, he felt the weight of it. The map showed terrain he recognized: the Devil's Throat Canyon, Deadfall Ridge, the dry creek bed that only ran in spring. In the center, circled twice, was a location on the edge of Bailey Land and Callaway Land, right at the disputed boundary. "What's at that location?" he asked. Violet sat down across from him. "My husband drew that map," she said. "I found it hidden in the heel of one of his boots after he died. I didn't understand it at first, but I've been surveying these coordinates and I believe that location marks a water source." Alfred looked up from the map. "Underground water," she said. "A spring." Thomas and I had been noticing that one section of the pasture stayed green longer into drought season than it had any right to. He must have been investigating. If that spring exists at the coordinates he marked, and if those coordinates fall within my legal property boundary, not Callaway's fraudulently extended one, but my actual legal line, then it changes everything. Water rights in this territory are the difference between a ranch that survives and a ranch that doesn't. It also gives Callaway a much stronger motive, Alfred said quietly. "Yes," she said. "If he knows the spring is there, and I think he must, because his boundary manipulation targeted that exact area, then he's not just trying to absorb my grazing land. He's trying to steal water. And in this territory, in this drought, that water is worth more than the land itself." Alfred sat back and looked at the map for a long time. He thought about the 43 cents in his pocket and the tired horse in the barn. He thought about 2 years of drifting between jobs that felt like nothing, building nothing, leaving no mark on any place he passed through. He thought about Violet Bailey, alone on this property for 14 months, surveying her own land with scientific precision, filing records that disappeared, writing letters that went unanswered, holding everything together by sheer intelligence and refusal to give up. "You need the Potts affidavit from Redemption," he said, "and you need someone to survey that spring location and formally document it." "Yes," she said, "and you need it done before Callaway moves again." "He's patient," she said, "but he's not infinitely patient. I've been told he's engaged a new attorney in Albuquerque. My guess is he's planning to file a formal claim on the disputed acreage within the next few months, using the relocated markers as evidence of his boundary. Once that claim is filed, it becomes vastly harder to contest." Alfred looked at the map one more time. At the 2 circles drawn by a dead man's hand around a secret that had perhaps cost him his life. "I'll go to Redemption," he said. She did not thank him effusively or show relief. She simply nodded, as though this was a logical outcome she had calculated in advance. "I'll pay you for the trip in addition to your regular wages. I'll also give you a letter of introduction for Potts, and I'll write out the specific legal language I need in the affidavit." "You know the legal language," he said. "I know a great deal about land law," she said, with that same factual tone that was not boasting and not modesty but simply accuracy. "Thomas and I had to learn it quickly when the dispute began. I have continued to learn it since." He found himself looking at her in a way he had not permitted himself to look at a woman in a very long time. Not with desire, or not only with desire, but with something more complicated, a kind of recognition. She was fighting a battle that was unjust, and she was fighting it with intelligence and skill and absolute refusal to accept defeat. And that combination of things did something to his chest that he did not have immediate words for. He looked away before she noticed. Over the following days, as he prepared for the ride to Redemption and continued the urgent fence repairs, he learned more of the shape of her life. She had grown up in Kansas, the daughter of the surveyor Elias Crane, who had indeed taught his only child everything he knew. She had been educated beyond most women of her era because Elias Crane believed that education was too valuable to withhold on account of gender. She had read widely, could do trigonometric calculations in her head that most men needed paper and pencil for, and had a particular gift for spatial reasoning that made her surveying work exceptional. She had married Thomas Bailey at 23, following him west to New Mexico. Thomas, from everything Alfred gathered, had been a good man, honest, hardworking, devoted to Violet in the way that a man is devoted when he has found someone he genuinely considers his equal. The marriage had been happy. The land had been good. And then Harlan Calloway had begun his expansion, and Thomas Bailey had refused to bend. And now Thomas was in the ground under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the west pasture, and Violet was alone. She did not speak often of her grief, but Alfred began to notice it in small ways. The way she sometimes paused at the kitchen window in the evenings and looked west toward that cottonwood tree. The way she kept Thomas's old survey compass on the desk in the kitchen, cleaned and oiled, and clearly handled regularly. The way she occasionally used the word "we" when describing plans for the property and then caught herself and used "I" instead, with a brief compression of her lips that she suppressed almost immediately. She was not defeated by grief, but she was carrying it, the way a person carries a necessary weight, not denying its presence, not collapsing under it, but bearing it with a kind of deliberate steadiness that he found both heartbreaking and admirable. He left for Redemption on a Thursday morning with the map, a copy of the relevant survey coordinates, Violet's letter for Potts, and 4 days of provisions. She stood on the porch as he rode out and did not wave, but she watched him until he cleared the rise at the east end of the property, and he was aware of her watching with a precision that felt like something more than supervisory. The ride to Redemption took him through country that was beautiful in the way that New Mexico territory was always beautiful, vast and austere and unapologetically demanding. The sky in October at that elevation was a particular shade of blue that seemed too saturated to be real, and the mountains to the north were already carrying snow on their peaks. He camped 2 nights out under that sky and tried not to think too much about the woman he had left behind. He thought about her anyway. He thought about the map and what it meant that Thomas Bailey had hidden it in his boot. A man who hid something like that was a man who was afraid. Afraid and also deliberately leaving evidence for someone to find after he was gone. It was almost a message. Here is what I know, here is where it is, here is what they will try to take. Alfred thought about the kind of courage it took to be Thomas Bailey, and the kind of courage it took to be Violet Bailey, and the difference between them. Thomas had been afraid but had stood his ground and paid with his life, while Violet was afraid. He was certain she was afraid, even if she never showed it, but was standing her ground not out of the recklessness of ignorance, but out of the calculated determination of someone who knew exactly what she was risking, and had decided the principle was worth the risk. He reached Redemption on the 3rd afternoon and found Ezra Potts without difficulty. The old man was exactly where his letter said he would be, living in a small adobe house at the edge of town, with a vegetable garden and 3 cats, and the particular contentment of a man who has retired from hard work into something like peace. Potts was 71, bird-like and sharp-eyed, with the gnarled hands of a man who had spent decades in the field, and the careful manner of someone who understood the legal weight of a sworn document. He read Violet's letter 3 times, asked Alfred a series of precise questions about the survey situation, and then retrieved from a locked cedar chest a collection of field notebooks so old and careful that Alfred handled them with automatic reverence. "She's her father's daughter," Potts said, looking up from the letter. "Elias Crane. I knew his work. Excellent surveyor. She has his letter, you said, with the specific language for the affidavit." "Yes, sir," Alfred said, and handed it over. Potts read it and raised his eyebrows slightly. "She knows what she's doing," he said. "This language is exactly right, more precise than most attorneys I've worked with." The preparation of the affidavit took most of the following day. Potts dictated, a local justice of the peace witnessed and sealed, and Alfred received the completed document with a sense of something significant having shifted. A piece moved on a board, a weight added to one side of a scale. He also spent an evening with Potts simply talking, and learned things that mattered. He learned that the original 1871 survey of that section had been done with exceptional care because of a specific federal requirement related to water rights. The government had wanted precise records because of anticipated disputes over water sources as the territory filled in. He learned that the original field notes, which Potts had retained, contained specific coordinates for every surface water source and an assessment of underground water probability based on geological features. And he learned that Potts himself had noted in 1871 that the section now in dispute showed strong indicators of a subsurface spring. "I wrote that in my field notes in 1871, Potts said. "Right there." He pointed to a line in his cramped, careful handwriting. "Strong geological indicator of subsurface water source. Recommend formal assessment for homestead purposes." Alfred felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. Thomas Bailey's hidden map. The circled location. A spring worth fighting over, worth killing over. "Mr. Potts," he said carefully, "is that note about subsurface water in the affidavit as well?" Potts looked at him steadily. "I made certain of it," he said. "Mrs. Bailey's letter specifically requested documentation of all water-relevant observations. Very specific language. She knew exactly what she needed." Alfred rode back to Sorrow Creek with the affidavit in his saddlebag, and the feeling of a man who has been part of something important. He pushed harder on the return. He had been gone 4 days, and the thought of Violet alone on that property, with Calloway's men, watching the fences made a tightness in him that he did not try to rationalize. He arrived back on a Sunday evening to find a situation that immediately validated his anxiety. The front fence of the Bailey property, the section visible from the road, had been pulled down. 3 rails lay in the dirt, not rotten through. They had been recently repaired by Alfred himself, but pulled deliberately. The posts worked loose from the ground. 3 of Violet's cattle had wandered through the gap and were grazing on the road shoulder. Alfred got the cattle in first, then went to the house. Violet was at the kitchen table with Thomas's compass in her hand and a rifle leaning against the wall beside her. She looked up when he came in, and for a fraction of a second he saw something that might have been relief cross her face before she composed it back into steadiness. "Welcome back," she said. He set the saddlebag on the table and withdrew the affidavit. "Potts came through," he said. "Everything you asked for and something extra." He explained the note about the underground spring in the 1871 field records. He watched her read the affidavit, watched her go still as she reached the relevant section, watched her read it again. "He documented it in 1871, she said quietly, 13 years ago, before Calloway had any claim to that area." "Yes." She set the document down and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at Alfred. "Someone came yesterday," she said. "One of Calloway's men. He rode up to the property line and waited there for an hour, just watching. Didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just waited." "A message," Alfred said. "Yes, and this morning the fence." She paused. "He's accelerating." "Then so are we," Alfred said. "I'll repair the fence tonight. Tomorrow we survey the spring location and document it properly. And then we figure out how to get these documents to someone who isn't in Calloway's pocket." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. It was not soft. Exactly, Violet Bailey was not a soft woman, but it was open in a way her expressions generally were not, as though something had relaxed in her that was normally held very carefully in place. "Thank you," she said, "for going, for coming back." "I said I would," he said. "Many men have said things," she said quietly and looked away. "He went to repair the fence." That night, working by lantern light, reseating the posts and rehanging the rails, he thought about those 3 words for coming back, and the weight they carried. The implication that other men had said they would do something and then had not. That she had learned to hold her trust very carefully because it had been wasted before. Not by Thomas. He thought Thomas Bailey sounded like a man who had been precisely what he promised, but by others. By Calloway's corruption, by the sheriff's failure, by the legal system that was supposed to protect her, and had instead protected the man who had killed her husband. He thought about the kind of loneliness that produced a woman like Violet Bailey, capable of anything, trusting of no one, carrying everything alone not because she preferred it, but because she had been given no choice. He thought he might not be entirely objective about Violet Bailey anymore. That thought should have alarmed him more than it did. The next morning they rode out together to the spring location marked on Thomas's map. Violet carried the theodolite in its case, balanced across her saddlebag with the practiced ease of someone who had been transporting field instruments since childhood. Alfred carried the chain and stakes and the field book. The location was in a shallow depression at the western edge of the Bailey property, at least, the property as it should legally be before the marker fraud. It was a spot where the ground changed character subtly, where the soil was darker and the grass stayed green a little longer than the surrounding terrain. Alfred had noticed it on his initial fence inspection and thought it mildly unusual. Now, knowing what they were looking for, the signs were obvious. Violet set up the theodolite with movements so smooth and automatic that Alfred simply watched for a moment without moving to help. She leveled the instrument with the precise adjustments of someone who has done this 10,000 times, sighted through the eyepiece, and began to call out readings that Alfred wrote in the field book. They worked systematically, taking sightings from multiple positions, establishing the coordinates of the location with redundant precision. "The spring itself will be below the surface," Violet said, adjusting the instrument for a new angle. "But if we can establish the coordinates of this location and document the surface indicators, combined with Potts's 1871 notes, we have strong evidence that the underground water source is on my legal property. How do we actually find the spring?" Alfred asked. "Prove it's there." "We dig a test hole," she said simply. "I have a soil auger in the barn. If the spring is where Thomas's map indicates, we should hit water within 12 to 15 feet. They finished the survey measurements first, which took most of the morning. Alfred watched Violet work with an attention that he was increasingly failing to disguise even from himself. The way she moved, the way she thought, the survey was not just technical skill for her, it was language. She was reading the landscape the way he read text, and the complexity of what she was reading was extraordinary. She would take a sighting, note the measurement, then look up and scan the terrain with narrowed eyes, and he could practically see the geometric calculations running behind those dark eyes, translating raw numbers into spatial understanding. At one point, he made an error, wrote down a bearing incorrectly, transposing 2 digits. He did not notice the error, but she did, 3 readings later, and corrected it without reproach. "Check your previous entry," she said, not looking up from the instrument. "I'm reading 37 degrees 42 minutes, not 32 degrees 47. He checked. She was right. He had looked at his own notes and been certain of them, and she had corrected them from memory while sighting through an instrument 20 yards away. "How did you know?" he asked. "Because the traverse wouldn't close at 47 minutes, she said. "The geometry doesn't permit it." She paused and glanced at him, and for a moment something that might almost have been amusement moved in her eyes. "The numbers have to tell a consistent story. When they don't, one of them is wrong." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with something he was not quite prepared to name. He had worked with surveyors. He had worked alongside licensed professionals with years of formal education and government certification. He had never seen anyone catch an error that way from pure mental calculation, without checking, without pausing, in the middle of doing something else. It was the kind of spatial intelligence that was simply not common in man or woman, and seeing it deployed so casually, so matter-of-factly by a widow in a work coat in a New Mexico pasture, did something specific and irreversible to his understanding of the world. He did not try to hide his expression. He said, simply, "You are remarkable." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her face that he thought might be surprise, genuine surprise, as though the word remarkable had arrived at an angle she was not prepared for. Not compliments in general, perhaps, but this one. The specific one that acknowledged not her beauty or her strength or her courage, but her mind. "The numbers don't lie," she said finally, and went back to the instrument, and he watched the line of her jaw and the steadiness of her hands and thought, with perfect clarity, "I am in serious trouble." They brought the soil auger from the barn in the afternoon and dug the test hole at the precise location Thomas's map had marked. It was hard work. The clay substrate was dense and required muscle, and Alfred took most of the augering while Violet recorded the soil samples they extracted at each foot of depth, noting the changing composition in her field book with the same precision she brought to everything. At 11 feet, the soil sample came up wet. At 12 feet, water seeped into the hole from the sides. At 13 feet, they had standing water in the bottom of the test hole, and the water was clean and clear and cold, rising steadily. They both stood and looked at it for a long moment. "Thomas found it," Violet said. Her voice was steady, but something in it was different, a softness, a grief mixed with vindication that made Alfred look away to give her the privacy of the moment. "He found it and he hid the map in his boot and he died before he could tell anyone." Alfred said nothing. He understood that this was not a moment for his voice. After a while, Violet crouched beside the hole and cupped some of the rising water in her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "He would have been very pleased." "He was a smart man," Alfred said. "He was a very good man," she said. Smart came secondary. She stood and wiped her hand on her coat and picked up her field book. "We need to document everything here in detail. Water depth, rate of rise, soil samples at each level. And we need to get all of this, the affidavit, the survey documentation, the spring evidence, to an attorney in Santa Fe who isn't corrupted." "Do you know of one?" Alfred asked. "I know of one possibility," she said. "A man named Russell Holt. He had a dispute with Callaway 2 years ago over a mining contract, a legitimate legal dispute, and Callaway lost. That means either Holt is too honest to be bought or he's too smart to be found. Either quality will serve me. How do you contact him?" "In person," she said. "Someone needs to go to Santa Fe." He looked at her. "And this time you need to come with me. The spring documentation needs your testimony. Your survey records need your signature before a notary in Santa Fe." He paused. "And you can't stay here alone with Callaway's men testing the fences." She was quiet for a moment. "If I leave the property, we board up the house and put the cattle at Dodd's place," he said. "Dodd's has a paddock. I'll pay for it out of my wages. The property will be here when we return. And if Callaway uses our absence to do something irreversible—" "Callaway moves slowly when he's using legal strategy," Alfred said. "He won't want to create obvious evidence against himself before he files his claim. We have a window." She thought about it with the same methodical quality she brought to every problem, running the variables. Then she said, 3 days to Santa Fe if we push. A day for the attorney, 3 days back, a week total." "Yes," he said. "All right," she said, and she went back to documenting the spring. They left 2 mornings later. Violet's cattle settled at Dodd's paddock, Dodd's having been paid with a solemnity that suggested he understood something important was happening. The house shuttered and locked, the survey documents and affidavit wrapped in oilcloth in Violet's saddlebag. She also carried Thomas's map, the original, the one hidden in his boot heel. She would not leave that behind. The ride to Santa Fe was 3 days of hard travel through country that was simultaneously magnificent and exhausting. Alfred had made this ride before, in various configurations, and he knew the landmarks. He also knew the places where a rider could get into trouble, ambush points, desolate stretches where a horse could go lame and leave a person in genuine danger. On the second night, they made camp beside a creek in a shallow canyon, and he built a fire while she saw to the horses with the same competent efficiency she brought to everything, checking hooves and checking the saddle sores he had warned her about on the bay mare she rode. They ate in a companionable quiet that was becoming familiar, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, that two people develop when they have worked closely enough together that speech is not always necessary. He had noticed this developing over the past weeks, this ease between them, and he was careful with it the way you are careful with something valuable that might be fragile. After a while she said, "Why did you leave the railroad?" He glanced at her across the fire. "What did you hear?" "Nothing specific, just that you had worked for them and then hadn't." He thought about it. "The Union Pacific had good surveyors," he said. "I wasn't the best of them by any measure. But I was honest, and that became a problem." She waited. "In 1881, we were surveying a route through Wyoming Territory. There was a section where the honest line, the line that reflected the actual terrain, would have required more grading than the company wanted to pay for. The chief engineer proposed an alternative survey. On paper, the numbers worked, sort of. In the field, it would have required taking the line through a section that belonged to a group of Shoshone families. Families that had been there for generations. The alternative route was chosen because it was cheaper, and because the people in the way of it weren't considered people who needed to be inconvenienced by legal process. Violet was watching him steadily. "I filed my objection in writing," he said, "which was noted and disregarded. I refused to participate in the revised survey. I was released from my contract and told that my future employment prospects in railroad surveying would be limited." He paused. "They were right about that. I haven't worked for a railroad since." "You tried to do right by people who were being dispossessed," she said. "I didn't succeed," he said. "But you tried," she said. "That's not nothing." Looked at her across the fire. "It felt like nothing at the time." "I know that feeling," she said quietly. "I've been trying to do right by this property and by Thomas's memory for 14 months, and there have been many days when it felt like I was throwing stones at a mountain. But the alternative is to stop trying, and I can't accept that." "No," he said. "I know you can't." She looked at him with that particular expression that was not quite a smile but carried some of the warmth of one. "You say that like you know me well." "I've been watching you work for 3 weeks," he said. "I think I know some things about you." A pause, the fire between them. The creek running in the darkness, the extraordinary sky above the canyon. "What do you know?" she asked, and her voice was careful but not closed. He thought about it honestly. "I know you don't ask for help easily," he said. "Not because you're too proud, but because experience has taught you that help often doesn't come or comes with conditions. I know that underneath the practicality there is a great deal of feeling that you protect very carefully. I know that you loved Thomas Bailey in a real way, and that his death left a wound you haven't had time to address because you've been too busy surviving. And I know that you're the most intelligent person I've shared a survey chain with, which is not a small category." She was very quiet for a while. The fire crackled. A coyote called somewhere up the canyon wall. "You're more perceptive than I initially gave you credit for," she said finally. "I thought you were simply a competent man looking for work." "I am a competent man looking for work," he said. "No," she said. "You're something else. I'm not entirely certain what yet." He did not push further, and she did not elaborate, and they settled into their separate blankets with the fire between them and the vast New Mexico sky above. And Alfred lay awake for a long time listening to the creek and thinking about dark eyes that could catch a transposition error from 20 yards away by pure geometry. They arrived in Santa Fe on the 3rd afternoon, and Violet knew the town, had been there twice with Thomas, and led them to a reputable boarding house on Palace Avenue, where she negotiated 2 rooms efficiently. And they cleaned the road dust off themselves, and ate a real meal for the first time in 3 days at a restaurant that had glass in its windows and tablecloths that had been laundered within living memory. At dinner, across a table that was small enough to feel intimate without being improper, she looked different. Still herself, still precise, still carrying the intelligence in her eyes as visibly as other women carry jewelry. But something had eased slightly. Some constant vigilance that the ranch required was not required here in the same way, and he saw for the first time what she might have looked like before all of this, before Calloway and Thomas's death, and 14 months of fighting alone. She was beautiful in that moment. Not ornamentally beautiful, but essentially beautiful. The kind that comes from a face that reflects genuine intelligence and genuine feeling, that has been shaped by experience into something with depth and character. He was aware of this in a way that he was not able to dismiss with practicality. She caught him looking and he did not look away, and something passed between them that they both, by silent agreement, did not name. The next morning they found Russell Holt. The attorney was a dry, deliberate man of about 50 with a salt and pepper beard and the eyes of someone who had been lied to by very skilled liars and had developed accordingly precise lie-detecting capabilities. He received them in his office, read Violet's summary letter first, then asked to see the documents. He went through them slowly: the affidavit from Potts, the field notes from 1871, Violet's own survey documentation, the copy of the original deed, and finally Thomas's map, which Violet laid on the desk last with a quietness that said this was the thing she had carried the longest and the most carefully. Holt looked at everything for a very long time, then he looked up at Violet. "This is the most complete land fraud case I've seen presented by a lay person in 20 years of practice," he said. "I'm not entirely a lay person," Violet said. "I'm a trained surveyor." "I can see that," he said. He tapped the affidavit. "Ezra Potts. I know his reputation. His signature is gold." He tapped the spring documentation. "The underground water evidence, combined with the 1871 field notes and your own survey records of the marker positions, creates an extremely strong case." He looked at Thomas's map. "And this is remarkable. A deceased property owner's own documentation of a valuable water source, hidden from view, constitutes significant evidence of both the resource's existence and the decedent's awareness of its potential value as a motive. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Violet said. "It supports the argument that Thomas knew about the spring and that the spring's value was a motive for his death." "Exactly," Holt said. "Now, I cannot charge the Calloway family with your husband's murder on this evidence alone. That is a criminal matter and requires different standards. But I can file a civil action in federal court, not territorial court, where Calloway has connections, and seek both restoration of your boundary markers and a formal declaratory judgment on the water rights. Federal jurisdiction removes Sheriff Trent from the equation entirely." Alfred watched Violet absorb this and process it rapidly. "The timeline," she said. "If Calloway is about to file a competing claim, I can file an emergency injunction this week to prevent any competing claims from being processed while the federal case is pending," Holt said. "It's a standard procedure in boundary fraud cases. That stops the clock on Calloway's filing." Violet looked at Holt for a long moment. Alfred saw her weighing everything: the cost, the timeline, the risk, the hope. "What will this cost?" she asked. Holt named a figure. It was significant. Alfred watched Violet's expression not change. "I can pay half now and half upon resolution," she said. "And if the case results in full restoration of my property rights and water rights, I'll add a bonus at resolution. Those are my terms." Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Those are acceptable terms, Mrs. Bailey." They spent 2 more days in Santa Fe while Holt prepared the documents and filed the emergency injunction. Violet reviewed every draft he produced with the thoroughness of someone who could and would find errors. And she found 2 not legal errors but factual ones: descriptions of the survey measurements that were slightly imprecise. And she corrected them in a way that made Holt look at her with the particular respect that professionals have for unexpected expertise. Alfred spent those 2 days doing what he could, helping organize the documentary evidence, filing affidavits where his own witness testimony was relevant, and navigating the parts of the legal process that required physically moving between offices and waiting in lines, which he did without complaint. He was aware that his role in this enterprise was primarily logistical and physical: the riding, the lifting, the standing between potential danger and the woman doing the actual intellectual work. And he found, to his own surprise, that this arrangement felt not diminishing but simply right. He was good at what he contributed. She was brilliant at what she contributed. Together, it worked. On the second evening, they walked along the plaza in Santa Fe in the blue dusk of an October evening, the adobe buildings golden in the fading light, a vendor selling roasted corn near the fountain, the sound of Spanish and English and the local Pueblo dialect mixing in the mild air. She had let her hair down, which he had not seen before. It fell past her shoulders, dark and simply done, and she wore a wool coat he had not seen either. She must have packed it for the city. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been permitted for 2 days to be slightly less vigilant, and the result was a kind of ease that he found breathtaking. "My father used to say," she began, and then paused. She started again. "He used to say that a survey is an act of justice, that the whole point of measuring the land correctly is so that no one can lie about it, so that the truth of where things actually are can stand up in a court or in a dispute and hold." He thought of it as an ethical act, not just a technical one. "He was right," Alfred said. "I've thought about that a great deal in the past year," she said. "Doing the survey work on my property by myself in the evenings after the ranch work was done, feeling like I was preserving something, a record of the truth that no one could take away once it was properly documented." "You were preserving Thomas's boundary," Alfred said. "Yes," she said, "and now it might actually mean something, because of Potts, because of the spring documentation, because of you." She paused. "I haven't been able to say that in a very long time. Because of someone else, I've become accustomed to saying because of myself." "That's not a small thing," he said. "Everything you've done alone, that's not nothing either." "No," she said, "but it's lonely." The word fell between them simply, without drama. Lonely. She had said it in a tone that was neither self-pity nor complaint but simply honest acknowledgement, the way she said most things. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Violet," he said. She looked up at him. The plaza fountain was behind her, the sky going purple above the mountains in the west, the vendor's lantern casting warm light. Her eyes were very steady. He said carefully, "I don't know how to tell you something without it feeling like the wrong time or the wrong circumstance or inappropriate to everything you've been through." "Then tell me plainly," she said. "I prefer plain." "I know you do," he said, and almost smiled. "All right, plain. I came to your property looking for work 5 weeks ago. I was a man going nowhere in particular. I don't want to leave. I don't want this thing to end when the legal case is settled and the boundary is restored. He stopped. "I don't know exactly what I want or what would be right to want, given that you love Thomas. Thomas has been gone for 14 months, she said quietly. "My grief for him is real and it will always be real, but I am still living. She paused. "I am not made of stone, Alfred." He looked at her. "You are the first person in a very long time," she said carefully, "who has seen what I can do and respected it rather than finding it inconvenient. Do you know how rare that is? Even Thomas, who was a good man, there were moments when my capability made him slightly uncomfortable, because men are taught to be the capable ones, and I made that uncomfortable sometimes. You have never once been uncomfortable. You looked at me catching that traverse error and you said I was remarkable and you looked like you meant it," and she stopped herself. "I'm not speaking plainly enough. I'm being oblique." "You're not being oblique at all," he said. "Then you understand what I'm saying." "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. And she began walking again, but when he fell into step beside her, she did something she had not done before. She put her hand through his arm, the way a woman walks with someone she trusts, and he covered her hand with his, and they walked the plaza in the Santa Fe dusk, and did not speak for a long time, and it was the most contented Alfred Merritt had felt in 2 years. They rode home to Sorrow Creek 3 days later, and the property was intact, the cattle safe at Dodd's paddock, the house as they had left it, the fences unviolated. Calloway had apparently decided, or been advised, that moving on the property while a legal process might be in motion was inadvisable. November came, and the legal process moved with the particular slowness of federal courts, but Holt was steady and precise in his updates, letters arriving at Sorrow Creek every 10 days or so, delivered by the mail rider who came through on Thursdays. The emergency injunction held. The case was moving forward. Holt had filed the boundary fraud claim and the water rights claim simultaneously, and had done so with the evidence organized in a way that was, he wrote, as close to bulletproof as I've seen in 20 years. Calloway responded through his own attorneys with counterclaims that were, Holt wrote in a later letter, technically creative but factually unsupportable given the quality of your survey documentation and the Potts affidavit. During those weeks, Alfred continued to work the ranch. He fixed what needed fixing, managed the cattle with Violet's direction, repaired the barn roof before winter came in earnest, and cut enough firewood to keep the house warm through the coldest months. The work was satisfying in a way that surprised him, not because it was extraordinary work, but because of where it was, and for whom and with whom. He and Violet worked well together and talked easily and argued occasionally about specifics, about the right way to rotate the cattle between pastures, about whether a particular section of fence should be repaired or replaced, about whether the cold frame for the winter garden needed an additional glazing layer. And the arguments were the kind that two intelligent people have when they both have opinions and both are willing to engage. And they were usually resolved by one of them demonstrating that they were correct, or by a compromise that neither of them initially proposed, but which turned out to be better than either original position. He admired her deeply. He told her so, not in grand speeches but in the small specific ways that accumulate into something real, pointing out something she had done well, asking her opinion and genuinely wanting it, listening when she talked about surveying or land law or her father or her plans for the property with the full attention that says you believe what is being said is worth hearing. And she, who had been carefully holding everything at a certain distance, began, incrementally, to open. She laughed more, not the controlled, managed version of amusement she had shown in the early weeks, but real laughter, surprised out of her by something he said or did. She asked him questions about his life with a curiosity that felt genuine. She told him things about herself, not the practical things he had learned by working alongside her, but the interior things, what she had loved about Kansas before she left it. The first time her father had put a theodolite in her hands, and she had looked through the eyepiece and felt with absolute certainty that she had found her language. The trip west that she and Thomas had made in 1877, the two of them in a wagon with everything they owned, and the morning they had crested a rise and seen the New Mexico plain spread out before them, and both gone completely silent with awe. One December evening, with snow coming down outside and a fire going in the hearth and supper done, she was sitting at the kitchen table doing calculations by lamplight, and he was reading a newspaper from Santa Fe that Dodds had brought out, and she said, without looking up from her calculations, "I want to expand the survey operation." He looked up from the newspaper. "Expand it how?" "As a business," she said. "There are no licensed surveyors in this county. The nearest is in Albuquerque. Ranchers and homesteaders are constantly dealing with boundary disputes and having to wait months and pay enormous travel fees for a surveyor to come from the city. I could offer that service locally." She looked up. "I can't license under my own name in New Mexico territory. The licensing board doesn't accept women, but I know a man who would lend his license to a business in which I did the actual work." "Who?" he said, and then understood immediately. "Me. Orville Marsh told me you sat for the licensing examination in 1881 and passed." she said. "You're a licensed surveyor. You haven't been practicing because you haven't had the instruments or the client base." "I have the instruments. I have the skill. I have the reputation. Every rancher in this county has heard about the boundary case." She paused. "It's not just, and I won't pretend it is, that your name would have to be on the license while my work produces the results, but it's practical, and it would be a true partnership." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since October," she said. "You trusted me with something you'd been planning for 2 months before you said anything about it." "I needed to be sure," she said simply. "I am sure now." He felt something expand in his chest, not just the idea of the work, which was genuinely appealing, but the word she had used, partnership. The precision of it coming from someone for whom words were tools chosen carefully. "Yes," he said. "Do it." The federal case was decided in February of 1885. The letter from Holt arrived on a Thursday, and Violet opened it at the kitchen table with Alfred standing beside her because he had been watching her face all morning and knew she was bracing for news in either direction. She read it silently. He watched her face. She closed her eyes for a moment. "We won," she said. Her voice was very quiet. He sat down. "Full restoration of the original boundary," she said, reading aloud now. "Water rights to the spring formally declared and registered as belonging to the Bailey property. A finding of fraudulent marker relocation, naming Harlan Calloway as responsible. A financial penalty and an injunction barring Calloway from any further interference with Bailey property." She looked up. Her eyes were bright. "And Holt writes that the federal judge made a referral to the U.S. Marshal's office regarding the circumstances of Thomas's death. That's not a guarantee of anything, but it's something." Alfred reached across the table and covered her hands with his. She did not pull away. She looked at him with that expression he had come to know, open, measured, genuine, and she said, "I should go tell Thomas." He understood. He went with her. They walked to the cottonwood tree at the edge of the west pasture in the February cold, snow on the ground still from the last storm, the sky bright and painfully blue. The marker was simple, a stone Thomas had placed himself years before they had known any marker would be needed there. She stood in front of it for a while, and Alfred stood slightly behind her, not intruding but present, which was what was needed. She did not cry. He had not expected her to. But she said something quietly, too quiet for him to hear, that was clearly addressed to Thomas Bailey, and whatever it was seemed to complete something in her, some final account that needed to be settled. When she turned back to Alfred, she was different, not in any dramatic way, but in the way of someone who has set down a weight that they have been carrying at significant cost and can now stand straight in a new way. "He would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," Alfred said. "I respect everything I know about him." He would have said, she smiled, a real full smile that he had seen only rarely and that rearranged everything in his chest when it appeared. He would have said, "Good. Now fix the fence." Alfred laughed. It surprised him, the laugh, and how good it felt. "Which fence?" "All of them," she said. "There are always fences that need fixing." Spring came with the particular force of New Mexico springs, sudden and abundant after the white winter, and the survey business they had begun under the banner of Merritt and Bailey Land Services was already receiving more work than Alfred had anticipated. Word had spread quickly. Violet's reputation for precision was already known in ranching circles from the boundary case, and the cases that came in were legitimate disputes that needed careful work and honest resolution. She was extraordinary at it. He had known she would be, but seeing it in practice, watching her navigate difficult client conversations, translate technical survey findings into plain language that farmers and ranchers could understand, manage the social complexity of disputes between neighbors who would continue to have to live alongside each other after the boundary was settled, was revelatory. She had not just technical skill but wisdom, and wisdom in a person of 28 was not common and was clearly hard-won. Alfred handled the licensing, the official filings, the physical field work that required the most demanding terrain navigation, and the client-facing business that still required, in this era and region, a man's name on the letterhead. He was aware of the injustice of this architecture but could not unilaterally change it. What he could do was make certain, in every internal and external discussion, that it was clearly understood whose skill was driving the work. In April, Alfred Merritt asked Violet Bailey to marry him. He did it not with grandeur but with the plainness she had always said she preferred. They were in the kitchen after supper, the same kitchen where she had handed him the map that had changed everything, and he said simply, "I love you. Not in spite of everything you are or in spite of your capability or your independence, but because of all of it. Because of who you are and how you live and what you're building. I want to build it alongside you if you'll let me." She was quiet for a long moment. He did not try to fill the silence. "I love Thomas," she said, "I know. And I love you," she said. "Differently because you are a different person and I'm a different person than I was when I married him. But truly, I know that too," he said. "All right," she said, and smiled that full smile. Yes. They were married in May of 1885 in the church in Sorrow Creek that was now mostly rebuilt from the lightning strike, by the reverend who had been patient enough to wait for the building to be repaired before performing the service. The ceremony was attended by most of the town, Percival Dodds and his wife, the families of neighboring ranches, Ezra Potts, who had made the long ride from Redemption, because Violet had written him a letter that had moved him enough to come, and a young surveying apprentice named Carter, whom they had recently taken on to help manage the expanding caseload. Violet wore a dress that was not white. She was practical even about this, but deep blue, which was the color, she told him privately, that she associated with open sky and open country and things that were good. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers from the kitchen garden. She walked to him steadily, with her characteristic unhurried confidence, and when she stood beside him and looked up at him, her eyes were the brightest he had ever seen them. He thought he might not have a fully adequate word for what he felt in that moment. The reverend was efficient and the ceremony was simple, and when it was done, they walked out into the May sunshine as a married couple, and Violet raised her face to the sky for a moment with her eyes closed, and he watched her do it and thought he would carry that image to the end of his days. The summer that followed was the best of Alfred Merritt's life. The ranch produced well the spring, now formally theirs, providing reliable water through what turned out to be another dry season, giving them a critical advantage in the drought. The survey business grew steadily. They hired Carter full-time, and he was learning quickly under Violet's instruction, developing into a solid field surveyor while she managed the increasingly complex legal and technical dimensions of the cases they took. Harlan Calloway was indicted by a federal grand jury in August of 1885. The U.S. Marshal's investigation into Thomas Bailey's death, combined with testimony from two of Calloway's former ranch hands who came forward after his civil defeat, resulted in charges of murder and criminal fraud. Calloway was arrested in September and held in federal custody in Albuquerque pending trial. The ranch hands who had moved Violet's boundary markers were also charged as accessories to the fraud. Violet received this news with a quietness that Alfred had learned to recognize as the way she received things that mattered deeply. She was in the kitchen when the wire came, and she read it, and then she set it down and was still for a while, and Alfred stood near her but did not speak. After a time she said, "Justice is slow." "Yes," he said. "But it comes," she said. "When people are persistent," she looked at him, "and when they have help." In the fall, they found that Violet was expecting their first child. She told him on an October morning, almost exactly a year after he had ridden up to her property looking for work, and she told him the way she told everything, plainly, directly, with her eyes steady on his face to see his reaction. His reaction was beyond what he could contain. He pulled her into his arms and held her, and she made a small surprised sound and then relaxed into him and held on in return, her arms strong around him. "A baby," he said, because he needed to say it aloud to believe it. "In the spring," she said. "April or May, I think." He held her for a long time in the October kitchen, with the windows showing the gold cottonwood and the blue sky and the healthy pastures of the Bailey spread now, and thought about the map in a dead man's boot heel, and a woman with a theodolite who had caught his traverse error from 20 yards away, and a 43-cent ride into a town called Sorrow Creek that had turned out to be anything but sorrowful. Their son was born in late April of 1886, on a night when the spring wind was moving through the cottonwood outside, and the kitchen garden was blooming for the first time under Violet's full season of attention with Alfred's help. She was characteristically deliberate, even in labor, methodical, focused, managing the experience with the same resourceful competence she brought to every difficult undertaking, which made him simultaneously awed and half frantic with uselessness, in a way that she found quietly amusing. The baby arrived in the early hours before dawn, attended by the local midwife, and when Alfred held his son for the first time, this small, furious, astonishingly perfect person, he understood something about love that he had not understood in any previous formulation of the concept. It was not the same as what he felt for Violet, but it was the same order of thing, specific and particular and rooted in something real. They named him Thomas Elias Merritt. Thomas for the man who had found the spring and hidden the map, and stood his ground and paid for it, whose integrity had made this land worth fighting for. Elias for the man who had taught his daughter that precision was an ethical act and that knowledge did not diminish with the sharing. Violet nursed their son and looked at Alfred across the lamplight of the bedroom and said, "He has your hands." Alfred looked at his son's hands, tiny and opening and closing in the way of newborns exploring the air. "God help him if he tries to be a surveyor," he said. "He'll have two of them telling him he's doing it wrong." She laughed. He had learned to treasure that laugh, its rarity making it precious. Harlan Calloway was convicted in the federal trial of November 1886. The jury needed only 4 hours. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for fraud and, on a lesser charge in Thomas Bailey's death, the evidence of murder being sufficient for conviction on manslaughter, given the testimony of the ranch hands, an additional 12 years to run concurrently. He would not be free again, while he retained meaningful capacity to threaten anyone. When the conviction was reported in the Santa Fe New Mexican and the paper reached Sorrow Creek, Violet read the article at the kitchen table with Thomas Elias on her lap, the baby now 7 months old and very interested in the newspaper's texture. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it aside. "It won't bring Thomas back," she said. "No," Alfred agreed. "But it means that what he died for, holding the land, protecting the water, refusing to yield to a man who had no right to what he wanted, it meant something. It held. The line held." "The line held," Alfred said. She looked at him with her dark eyes and the expression that was now familiar, open and precise and full. "You held it with me," she said. "You held most of it," he said honestly. "I just rode to redemption and didn't lose the affidavit." "Don't minimize it," she said with a sharpness that was affectionate. "You know better than that. Every piece of it mattered. Every piece of it was a choice. You chose this." He had chosen this. He chose it every day, this woman, this land, this work, this life. He had ridden into Sorrow Creek with 43 cents and no direction, and he had been handed a map, and the map had been exactly what she had said. Work. The most meaningful work of his life. The survey business continued to grow through 1887 and into 1888. Carter became a full partner in the practice, taking on his own licensed status once he had accumulated enough field hours to sit the examination, which Violet helped him prepare for with the patient thoroughness of a natural teacher. The business was renamed Merritt Bailey Carter Land Services, which required some negotiation on Violet's part with Alfred, who had initially suggested just Merritt and Carter in a moment of misguided convention that she corrected with exactly 3 sentences and a single level look. They took on cases across 3 counties. Violet's reputation spread as the most precise boundary surveyor in the region clients specifically requested her, which created occasional awkwardness given the licensing constraints of the era. But she navigated those constraints with the same pragmatic intelligence she brought to everything. She also began writing up several of her cases as documented examples of survey methodology and submitting them to professional journals under the partnership's name. And the resulting publications were received with the kind of respect that comes when work is so clear and so well documented that even those inclined to dismiss its source cannot find fault with its substance. In the spring of 1888, Violet discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Alfred in the kitchen again. Same kitchen, same direct tone, same bright-eyed steadiness. And this time he knew what to do with the feeling. He simply held her. And she held him back. And their son Thomas Elias, now 2 years old and extremely opinionated about most things, tugged at his father's coat until he was picked up and included in the embrace, which he accepted with the magnanimous condescension of a person who considers himself the obvious center of any gathering. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1888. They named her Alara Crane Merritt. Alara because Violet had loved the sound of it since childhood, and Crane for her father, because the name of a man who had taught his daughter that skill and knowledge belonged to those willing to learn them, deserved to persist. Alfred Merritt, holding his daughter in the lamplit bedroom while his wife rested and his son slept in the next room, and the November wind moved over the land outside, thought about what it meant to have arrived somewhere. Not just geographically, the Bailey spread, the property that was now theirs both legally and in every other sense, but in himself. He had spent 2 years drifting not because he was restless, but because he had not yet found the reason to stop. He had found it in a woman with a theodolite and steady hands and dark eyes that could catch a traverse error from 20 yards by pure geometry. He had found it in the work of an honest life, shared. He carried Alara to the window and held her so she could see the night, though she was too new to see much of anything. The November sky was extraordinarily clear, the stars very bright, the cottonwood at the edge of the pasture standing dark and still. Below it in the ground, Thomas Bailey rested. His compass was still on the kitchen desk, still cleaned and oiled, still handled with care, because Violet had not stopped honoring him and Alfred had not asked her to. The dead deserve their memory. The living deserve their future. Alara made a small sound and reached upward with one uncertain hand toward the window or the stars, or simply toward light in the way that new people do. And Alfred watched his daughter reach and thought about maps and springs and 43 cents, and what it means when a man goes looking for work and finds, instead, the shape of his whole life. In the years that followed, the Bailey Merritt spread, most people called it that. The hyphenation having been Violet's specification from the beginning, became something of a landmark in that part of New Mexico territory. And then New Mexico, after the statehood process, began to move forward. The survey business anchored the family economically through the droughts and downturns that came intermittently in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, because land disputes do not pause for economic conditions and skilled, honest surveyors are always in demand. Carter proved to be an excellent practitioner and a good man, and he married a schoolteacher from Albuquerque in 1889 and eventually took over the day-to-day business management, while Alfred and Violet moved into an advisory role that suited them as they moved further into their 40s with the pleasantly exhausted contentment of people who have done significant work for many years. Thomas Elias Merritt grew up with a theodolite in his hands by age 10, and a talent for figures that Violet recognized with quiet satisfaction as her father's inheritance, carried 2 generations. He was also, to Alfred's great pleasure, naturally talented with horses and cattle and the physical work of the ranch, combining in himself the 2 halves of what his parents had brought to this place. Alara Crane Merritt grew up to be a reader of formidable appetite and a talker of equal formidable energy. And by 12, she had already announced her intention to become an attorney, specifically a land attorney, and had begun pestering Holt by letter for recommended reading, which Holt supplied with the cheerful thoroughness of an old man who recognizes a serious mind and delights in feeding it. On an October evening in 1891, the 7th anniversary of Alfred's arrival at the Bailey spread, a fact he had noticed and Violet had pretended not to notice, and then mentioned herself 2 days before he was going to mention it, because she was always faster. They sat on the porch in the gold late light, the cottonwood doing what cottonwoods do in October, the sound of Thomas Elias managing the evening cattle check drifting from the pasture. The smell of Alara's supper preparations coming from the kitchen, where she had appointed herself cook for the evening with the authority of a 7-year-old who has decided. Violet had Thomas's old compass in her hand. She did that sometimes in the evenings, just held it, turned it in her fingers, the way some people hold worry beads or a smooth stone, not with grief anymore or not primarily, with something more like gratitude. "I've been thinking," she said. "You're always thinking," he said. "It's one of your most consistent characteristics." She gave him a sidelong look of combined amusement and exasperation that he had catalogued extensively over 7 years. "I've been thinking about the journal paper. The one I presented to the Territorial Land Office last month. The one they initially refused to schedule and then scheduled only after Holt wrote them a letter. That one," she said, "was received well." "It was received extremely well," Alfred said. "The commissioner called it the most rigorous treatment of boundary error analysis he'd read in 20 years. "Yes," she said, "which means it's time for the next one." She glanced at him. "I've been documenting the water rights methodology, the spring case and 3 subsequent cases. I want to write them up as a formal methodology paper, a systematic approach to documenting subsurface water indicators for legal purposes. There's no such document currently. Every case is handled differently and the inconsistency allows for manipulation." Alfred looked at her. "You want to write the standard?" "Someone should," she said. "And I have the cases, I have the data, I have 7 years of field documentation." She paused. "I also have your name for the submission, which I use without apology because it's still necessary and we've already had that conversation." "We have," he agreed. "And the version of me that suggested it was wrong would be the first to agree with you." She smiled. He watched the smile and thought, for perhaps the 10,000th time since a particular October evening in Santa Fe, that it was the best thing he'd ever seen. "Will you help me with the drafting?" she asked. "The technical writing I can do, but the sections that require diplomatic framing, the parts where I need to say that the existing practice is inadequate without making enemies of everyone who currently practices it, you're better at that than I am." "You're better at it than you think," he said. "But yes, I'll help." From the kitchen came the sound of something clattering and Alara's voice saying, with great dignity, that she had intended to drop that and it was all part of the plan. Alfred and Violet both looked at the kitchen window. Then they looked at each other. The laughter came simultaneously, and it was warm and real and unhurried, the laughter of people who are where they are supposed to be. The paper was submitted in 1892 and published in the Journal of the National Association of Engineers in 1893, the first such paper authored, however obliquely, by a woman in the publication's history, a fact that the editor noted in his introduction with what had been intended as qualification but read, Violet thought, as precisely the kind of acknowledgement that makes the next thing slightly more possible. And the next thing became possible, and then the next, in the way of things that are built carefully on honest foundations by people who understand that permanence is not given but made, measurement by measurement, argument by argument, season by season, in the country that demands everything and returns it multiplied when you hold your line. Thomas Bailey had found the spring and hidden the map in his boot because he was afraid, and because he wanted the truth to survive him. It had survived him. It had done more than survive. It had grown, through the hands of the woman he had loved, and the man she had loved after him, and the children who carried all of them forward into a future that none of them could fully see, but all of them had helped to build. Alfred Merritt had ridden into Sorrow Creek with 43 cents and no direction. He had found work. He had found a great deal more than work. He had found the place that needed him to be exactly who he was, not more, not less, not otherwise, and the person who could see what he was with the same precision she brought to the landscape, who read him as she read the numbers in her field book and found that they told a consistent story and chose to trust that story. And he had chosen every day since to be worthy of being read that way. Outside, the cottonwood dropped its October gold. The cattle moved in the evening pasture. The spring ran quietly underground, faithful and invisible, holding everything up. The line held.